Hi, everyone. Magdalena Diaz again here at the Empowerment Roundtable. We have some amazing speakers from all backgrounds that are going to talk to us a little bit about their work with self-defense, empowerment self-defense. So I'll let them introduce themselves and then we'll get right into it. And why don't we start with Nicole?
Hello, Magdalena. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here in the presence of all these powerful and inspiring women. So my name is Nik Snell. I am the CEO of Girls Fight Back. It is an empowerment self-defense course that was founded in 2001 by Erin Weed in honor of her friend Shannon McNamara, who was murdered in her off-campus apartment. And we've empowered over 1 million people all over the world. I took over the company this year, and my mission is to continue giving women and people of all genders the skills that they need to defend themselves and to live their lives freely and confidently, because we are our own best protectors and we are worth fighting for. So that is my mission. I am also a lead instructor with Impact Personal Safety. And prior to COVID, I was teaching full contact classes. Now we are teaching our classes online, but we focus heavily on verbal skills as well as teaching people that they have the power within themselves to defend themselves if necessary.
Thank you, Nicole. We'll move over to Beth.
Hi, my name is Beth Bowman. I'm a licensed therapist. I've been in the mental health field for 31 years. I've also been a martial artist for the same length of time. I work primarily with women in my practice, and they range in age from college age up to 80. And we work on addressing trauma. And as you know, that can come in all different forms. And we work on boundary issues. We work on setting limits. We work on recovery. I just had one this week, a 75-year-old who has decided to leave her partner and rent her own home for the very first time. So we're about just teaching and assisting and empowering these women to step out and find their own voice. So I'm happy to be here, and thank you all. Look forward to the roundtable.
Thank you, Beth. We'll move on to Liz.
Hi, so thank you for having me, and it's great to see you guys. It's been a while. My name is Liz Fitzgerald. I am co-founder and pretty much everything doer of ASSERT Empowerment Self-Defense, which is a gender inclusive empowerment self-defense program that my husband and I created specifically to address not just women's empowerment and the need for women to, feel safe and know that they have the ability and the power and the strength that they need to take care of themselves, but also to address boys and men that have been survivors of trauma, and to also coach them as they're growing up and so on and so forth, to have a more gender inclusive attitude and view of the planet, so that we can maybe start scaling back some of the gender violence issues around the world. That's me in a nutshell.
Thank you, Liz. And then my co-host, I'll let them introduce themselves, but we can go with Tasha.
All right. Aloha, everyone. My name is Tasha Church, and I am the founder of LA Live Action. That's Women Living in Action. It's an empowerment coaching business. And I've been doing this work for 18 years. I love what I do, and I really love supporting women on their journey, self-empowerment and healing. I'm a survivor, and I know what it's like to actually live through a lot of different experiences. So it's been an honor to be able to help women and girls as they're going through this process and finding their voice. Because for me, it's highly important for them to understand that their voice matters. And I want them to be able to love themselves fiercely. So there we go.
Thanks, Tasha. And we move on to Reika.
Aloha, everyone. I am also in Hawaii. My name is Reika Bortas, and I am from Hungary originally. And I am a level 1 empowerment self-defense instructor and I teach self-defense classes for women, and I'm passionate about anything which is in connection with women empowerment. And I'm also a childbirth educator and a doula.
Thank you all. So today's topic, again, all of us have a background in working with survivors, either through our personal experiences, our communities, or actually as our work. And at least my background and my experience in advocacy, there was that gap, right? When I was working with survivors of interpersonal violence. I was giving them all the tools or trying to support them with all different tools. And one of the things that was missing for me was the body. How do we feel empowered in our bodies after trauma has occurred? Because I mostly work after, I was more of reactionary after things happen and less preventative. But I did do some prevention work. And even with that, right, the college where I worked, when I was doing education and prevention, we focus more on bystander intervention, which is great. And it's obviously a needed tool. But there was that gap when I was doing these presentations and someone said, but what about if something is happening, right, to me? How do I defend myself? And so there was this gap for me, and I found ESD. And again, I was trained, I always say, like, this old school model of, obviously, we all agree that, the violence is always going to be the responsibility of the harm doer, and it's never the victim's fault. But that can also sometimes blind us in what resources we can provide for individuals. And I think that was a gap for me. And I was very anti, like, learning self-defense, because I think for me that I internalized it as, like, you're telling me that I need to do something to prevent violence, that it's somehow my fault. And, I'm still doing the work. I've only been doing self-defense for a year, and how we can incorporate self-defense as a primary prevention tool, while we still hold the harm doer accountable. And so that's kind of my background. I want to open up the discussion about, I know, Beth, you are a licensed therapist. So, like, how did you find that connection? How did everyone here find that connection between, this is prevention, this is primary prevention, and it's something that we should be teaching everyone?
Lots of times we get into discussions about boundaries, but at least with the women that I see. And so many of them, as survivors, blame themselves. And so part of it is just doing psychoeducation with them and helping them to understand, that this was not their fault, and addressing some of the shame that goes along with all those things. As women, we internalize things. So there's a lot to address with all of that. But the bridge, I think, is about finding your voice and being able to say things like, I matter and I'm worth defending, because I've seen women make huge strides when they're able to say that and to fully embrace it and believe it. And I'm sure everybody's got some stories along those lines as well.
So I feel like with the work that I do, I work primarily with college students and high schools, but also a lot with adults. And how I found that self-defense is preventative and healing for survivors at the same time is kind of like Beth said, it's education. It's the knowledge of knowing that you're worth fighting for. It's knowing that you have options, and just having those options can give you so much confidence. And there's so many studies out there that have shown that women who have learned self-defense, that have taken any sort of course that taught them how to be verbally assertive and taught them physical skills that they could use to defend themselves, they are less likely to experience an assault, because of the confidence that it gives them and the way they carry themselves through the world, and the more they're able to speak up for themselves. And there's a great study from the University of Oregon by Jocelyn Hollander, a sociologist, that studies this. And she has a great quote, and it says, I'm probably going to butcher it because I'm not quoting it exactly, but it's basically saying, just because a woman knows how to defend herself, it doesn't make it her responsibility to prevent violence against her. And I think that's a really important piece. Like, I want to learn so that I know, so that if there is a worst case scenario or a what if scenario, I have options to choose from. And it doesn't mean that then I have to prevent all violence against me. It's still never the survivor's fault, but having a choice about how to respond is always going to be better than not having a choice in how to respond. And having that choice and giving that choice back to a survivor can be so healing in the aftermath, because we know a sexual assault's about violence and power, and they've had their control taken away. And this is a way of giving them back some sense of control.
So just to sort of add to what Beth and Nicole were saying, I know for myself, I came from a very different background altogether. I was very corporate world, the entire thing. My husband was 100% activist the entire time. What became very, very clear for us, aside from the aspect of helping women, helping survivors, helping people in general to recognize their self-worth in response to, or in respect to, or in relation to the world around them, which I think is a very key part. We can have all the self-esteem in the world and think of ourselves as rock stars, but if we don't think that we're the equal rock star of the one next to us, it's still not going to make a huge difference. But for us, the approach of self-defense and empowerment self-defense came from looking at a little bit of the corporate world and a little bit of the environmental activism world, actually, where in the environmental field, you'll see that you've got organizations like Florida PIRG, which are lobby and, long-term solutions. So their focus is changing legislation, which, as we all know, can take ridiculous amounts of time, decades upon decades in some cases. And then on the other end, you have organizations like Earth First, which are essentially, tying themselves to trees because there's literally a tractor facing that tree, or, sea shepherds that are throwing paint onto, fishing boat decks and so on and so forth. And somewhere in the middle is Greenpeace, which their goal is to change public perception. And I think that if we're going to change not just personal attitudes about self-worth out in the world and in relation to the world, but just overall reduce the incidence of gender-based violence, sexual violence, etc., we really need to look at all three of those worlds, from the, pre and potentially, unfortunately, post-therapy, all the way to crap, everything has hit the fan, and now I've got to do something right here, right now, as we change the perception across the board, across all genders.
Yeah, just to add to all the great things which have been said, like, we know that empowerment self-defense is not just about physical self-defense. It's about empowering the students who come to classes, to help them to find their power, whether that be in like verbal interaction with others, whether that to have more confidence, to be able to stand up for themselves, or to say no. That's a big part of empowerment self-defense, to set your own boundaries, say no when you need to, say yes when you want to. And so so that's why I think it's really important, and that's why it's a really good way of primary violence defense, because it affects all areas of your life, not just like that for that occasion if they attack you on the street or whatever. Like, it empowers you with tools you can use your all your life, every day, with every interaction. So I think that's why it's a really powerful thing.
Rika, I definitely agree. I was thinking back as everyone's talking and just thinking about violence prevention and why it's so important and why I, took it to the schools. I was actually asked to come into a middle school, and the reason why was because the teen pregnancy in the middle school was too high. Which just breaks my heart. And then also bullying was really high in the schools. So in a matter of 3 years, I was able to reach 2,000 girls and be able to work with them in depth, doing surveys, being able to monitor, their confidence level and everything else. And in that time, it was just outstanding to see the results. We had a grant through the city, so we had to be able to take copious amounts of notes. And I'm very expressive and out there, but when it comes to details, I'm like, okay, this is an area of growth. So for me in that programming, it was like, okay, you have to write everything down, and just to be able to look at it solid on paper and see the extreme changes. I mean, we had girls who were dealing with molestation issues at home or through family that we were able to navigate and get them out of. We were able to help other girls to stick up for themselves when their boyfriends were pressuring them for sex for the first time, and all of these different issues. So it was amazing to actually see the confidence that was built just from learning those different tools. We focused on self-esteem, body image, and self-defense training, which in essence, it had a lot of aspects of what ESD is, which is why I love it so much. So it was amazing to me to see that transformation. And then also during that time, the first year of my launch of my program, I actually did deal with an attempted sexual assault by a stalker from inside my home. So that was this extreme learning experience when I realized that I wanted to help women through this process and through the process of healing through self-defense. So it's been this really interesting journey to be able to encompass these two different worlds of working with youth and what does that look like, and then working with adults and seeing the transformations, seeing the process of empowerment. Last year, I was lucky enough to get a phone call from a woman who had just navigated an attempted assault by her ex-husband who was trying to take her son away. And she had escaped to Maui to get away from him. So that was a really interesting experience, but it was just this aha moment for me because she called right after it happened, told me what she did, and I was like, oh my God, congratulations, it worked. And then instead of her going into this really scared space, she was very excited afterwards because she realized, she was like, I did it. I did what you told me to. And I was like, yes, you did. You are awesome. So, that's what I think comes from this work. And there are so many gifts to being able to practice and then also teach, because I think all of us are growing and learning and experiencing simultaneously. So so those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I agree with everyone, right? And I think what I hear from everyone, or how it resonates for me, is it's this debunking. I think the first step for a lot of us are in this violence prevention world, or trying to address gender-based violence, is and we want to incorporate self-defense or empowerment self-defense into our work. I think the first step, or at least what I'm hearing, is debunking this idea of self-defense, right? And I mean, I speak myself, for myself, that I also had this idea that self-defense meant like immediately going into like the physical self-defense, right? And that's all I was going to learn. And that's a really difficult thing to do if you're working with survivors or if you're working with marginalized populations, because to be able to physically defend myself, I first have to feel empowered, and I have to feel connected to my body in order to be able to utilize my body in that way. So I think the first part is debunking this idea, the other thing that, I'm thinking about as you all were talking and your work and how this is primary prevention, uh, self-defense is primary prevention, is I think of, like I said, at the campus where I work, we use bystander intervention as our primary prevention model. And we use the 3Ds. And this, I know people that do green dot or things like that, it's pretty similar across the board. And the 3Ds is like, when we're educating the campus community, if they ever see something that, might, appear violent, we give them these 3 tools, which is direct, distract, or delegate, right? That's by saying, like, so direct, if you see something, you can directly go up to them and say, hey, what's going on, right? If you feel safe. Distract, if you don't feel safe, find a way to distract, right? So we tell them if you see something, and you can maybe, if you're on campus, ask, hey, like, I'm lost, where can I find, this building? Or delegate, which is, if you don't feel comfortable going up to those individuals, you can go ask for help. But then I think of ESD, right? And the principles that we teach in ESD, a lot of these 3Ds we're also teaching in ESD, right? Or they can be incorporated for a foundation where people really feel comfortable, right? So when we're talking about direct, that's, nonviolent communication. That's the de-escalation that we're teaching in our workshops. And again, we're teaching it not just to survivors, but to folks that might be around violence, that might want to learn how to, like, I address this, and, there's family violence occurring in my home, either with, like, my siblings or my parents. And how do I feel empowered to be direct and address it, right? How do I do this in a safe way, not just for the other people involved, but for myself? When I think of distract, I think of, like, the running or the intuition, right? Really trusting yourself of what feels comfortable, right? And the delegate, again, the, tell, right? Like, go tell someone. So I think, again, that's what I'm hearing, like the debunking of this idea of self-defense as only the physical component, and how already all these primary preventions, models that we might have either out in the community or in, like, in education systems, how they can be incorporated and become one, right? I don't know if that's something that resonates with y'all, or that you think of, like, oh yes, this is how primary prevention was presented to me, and now I'm seeing how these two things, connect.
I think a challenge that, regardless of how we're looking at it, a challenge that we still face is making sure that we're culturally relevant. I've run into a lot of programs that are fantastic for Anglo-Caucasian, any gender or all genders, but very, very few that really address the additional issues that Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, Latin Americans, et cetera, Asians, all these, in the U.S., other cultures face, that are very different, and that the approach has to of course match what is available in that culture at that time, because you can't essentially come in and railroad an entire tradition of experience and history of a certain way that things have been done, and then expect everyone to be okay with it and to have no pushback. I mean, as it is in teaching white Anglo women, they still get pushback, obviously, from their abusers, from the people trying to take advantage of them in cultures like some Latin American cultures, and others around the world. That is tradition. That is something that you do not ever address. Things like honor killings, genital mutilation, female genital mutilation. Those are ingrained traditions that are hundreds, thousands of years old, that we're suddenly trying to teach women to rebel against, and which can result in, far worse consequences. So one struggle that I know that I face, and I think it's probably across the board, is translating the language of ESD and nonviolent communication into something that is culturally appropriate to reach all these different groups. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to bring up. I've actually taught a couple classes recently for Black women and for BIPOC women to address the things that we specifically face, especially around racism, systemic racism, injustice, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement being so reinvigorated this year after the deaths of, George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. And we face different the violence that we can face can be different than the violence that someone of a white person might face. Maybe when we set a boundary, now we have the risk of someone following us home or calling the police and lying, or something else, some other consequence. So our verbal strategies might have to shift and change and be used in a different way. So I think it's important when we're talking to different communities that we involve them in the discussion. Like, it's not us, I'm not going to go and teach to to a group to which I don't belong and think I know everything. Like, I would really like to get into making my programs more accessible for the LGBTQ community. But as I am not a member of the LGBTQ community, I know that I can't speak on the struggles that they have specific to them. So I would want to consult with someone and maybe train someone to teach so that they're learning from someone of their own community. So when it comes to having those really important cultural conversations, bringing in the culture that you're hoping to teach to is really important to get their point of view, to understand what their needs are. I had the privilege of teaching to the women and girls in Fiji a couple of years ago, and they had really excited to have Girls Fight Back and to learn from us. But I wanted to learn, like, what do they want to learn? Like, what are the things that they face? And so I asked, and I found out, like, you know what? Sometimes what we face as women, as far as like street harassment or catcalling, and survivors being societally forced into silence about what's happened to them, that is something that unfortunately women face all over the world. So there was a lot of similarities to what they face to what we face here in the US. And so integrating the program in and then using their word for no and stop was really kind of cool. And to hear everyone like kind of join together. And I remember them saying, we've never had anyone tell us this. We've never had anyone tell us that we could say no. Wait, I can say no? I don't have to just accept this. And it's like, yes, you have that power. And just knowing that you're helping someone else is so powerful, and knowing that they might take that and that might change the trajectory of their life. But sorry, long way to say, I agree with you that yes, when you're speaking to different cultures, it's important to understand what they're going through and bringing them directly into the conversation and not teaching to them, but making it collaborative.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I'm like super passionate about. And like I mentioned, like I attempt to teach from a intersectional lens and also from a decolonial lens. But I think when we're talking about primary prevention, either in our agency that we work for or like the campus, the school, a lot of these prevention programs already exist. Not only are they not incorporating all these other tools that I think are important, like using your body, right? They're also like, who are they centering and from what framework are they working? And something that you said, Nicole, in regards to, just because I know how to defend myself doesn't mean that I have to defend myself from all violence. I really resonate as a woman of color, and someone that's visibly a woman of color, because I also think of part of debunking self-defense and creating it into a primary prevention tool is also making it accessible. Who is it accessible to, right? For Black women, they're already inherently seen as violent individuals, just their existence, right? So they're not allowed, right, in our society to be violent, right, or to defend themselves, because something that you might say, I'm defending myself as a white woman, or even as myself as a woman of color, a non-Black woman of color, I can say I'm defending myself, and whatever I did, like raising my voice, right, that can be perceived for a Black woman as you're being violent, right? And I think language is so important. I found myself in situations where, like, if I've ever been assertive, right, and this has happened even like online, right? I had a situation where online I was just assertive about something that was said. And I thought, I took time. I was like, okay, let me make sure that the way I'm right. We have to think about the words we're going to use. And a lot of times when you're in a dangerous situation, you might not have 20 minutes to think of the right word to say, right? but I had time because it was online. Okay, let me think of the right terms where it's not going to be activating for individuals, where it's not going to be perceived as attacking someone. And I thought I responded in a manner that was like open for dialogue. And the first response was, why are you attacking me? Right? Again, my ability to defend myself was shrunken to, you are attacking me immediately, right? And folks around, like the spectators or the bystanders, also saw it as that. And so then there was this buildup, right, of me attacking them. So I think of that, right? Obviously online, I was safe where I could log off and say, I'm not going to interact. But if this was in public, or how is this creating a society where violence towards, Black or POC women is, okay, or where we're not allowed to defend ourselves due to like, our, what people assume of our race. So I think to make it a really accessible preventative program, not only are we talking about like all the tools that we should be teaching, but also how is it accessible, and the programs that we have now, are they centering certain individuals? And I know, Tasha, you had your hand up.
So yeah, what you're saying, everyone's saying is resonating with me a lot. I have some different experiences that have happened throughout my life based on, it really honestly depends on if I have spent more time in the sun and I look darker, then I suddenly am in a completely different category. And it's a different conversation where I will have an interaction, like what you're talking about, Magdalena, where suddenly someone looks at me and is like, why are you being so violent? Why are you talking to me in that way? Why do you have such an attitude? Whereas I could have a conversation and it might be the winter time, or I haven't spent a lot of time in the sun, and I have noticeably had conversations with people where it's suddenly like, oh, I like how direct you are. I like how confident you are. And so it's an interesting conversation to have about this language and about these different associations that we have on an unconscious level, or that people have on an unconscious level, when addressing race and the intersectionality between that and the work that we're doing. And I think that it is really important when we are doing this work to recognize where our strengths lie, and working with people who who fit, like what you're saying, Nicole, of just making sure that, yes, you're more than willing to work with the LGBTQI community, but you also would want to consult with different people, be mindful of that. And I think that it is really important as we're doing this work to not just be like, I can work with anybody. Here you go. I'm more than willing to. It's that mindful step and understanding, and that capability to also take a step back and realize whether or not you're a good fit to work with different communities. And I know that for me, working with the Native American community, it's something that's near and dear to my heart. So last year I got to work with people connected to the Murdered Missing Native Women's group. And it is a completely different conversation than what I would have with a predominantly all-white women's group. So I think that it is a really important conversation, and I saw Liz's hand, and I'm just getting very curious as to what she has to say. So there you go.
Thanks, Tasha. I think Magdalena also touched on a really, really important aspect, which is the stereotypes that are already connected with our different cultures. So, you mentioned, if a Black woman is seen, so let me back up. So one of the things that we teach in our program is, yes, bystander action and participation. But we also try and teach the person that might potentially be defending themselves to think about what that perception is to those bystanders. Not just from a legal perspective, because that's unfortunate. That's an unfortunate reality of the country in which we live, which, is that whether or not you're at fault for something, it doesn't matter. You can be sued and you can be charged for anything. The question is, does it stick in court, right? So that's one of the aspects that we teach. And one of the ways that BIPOC people, and that come through our courses and stuff, one of the things that they have to face is that perception and that predetermined stereotype. Like, for example, something that I get a lot being Latina is, oh my God, you're so hot-blooded. Of course, because you're so passionate. It's like that. My passion has nothing to do with my nationality, my culture, the color of my skin, any of these things. Or, like Magdalena was saying, that there's an unfortunate perception that some groups are seen as naturally violent. Some groups are seen as naturally meek. Some groups are seen as, underhanded, or like they've got something up their sleeve at all times. And those are things that we have to battle. In a self-defense situation, which, as Rekha brilliantly pointed out, is an everyday occurrence. Whether you eat the salad or the donut, it's still a self-defense, situation kind of thing. So that's an additional hurdle in reaching out to these groups that we need to make sure that we're addressing. That while it is an unfortunate aspect of this sort of frontline, last ditch effort to stop an assault or an aggression of some sort, it can be interpreted by bystanders as this, that, the other thing, as by witnesses. So we may not get the help that we need from a bystander, or we may not get, if it ends up in court, we may not get the witness statements that we need or that we're looking for, unless we have a very specific, culturally relevant, but still specific sort of, and I hate to say script, but to some degree script. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's also, again, when creating a curriculum, or like if you're presenting this as a primary prevention, it's talking about these, the intersections. And I think it's also like the unseen identities that we hold. A lot of times we think we're so prepared, and we think, as a woman of color, I am able to identify, I can do these things, right? There's identities that I hold that are not visible, like the color of my skin. I'm formally undocumented. So that's something that, obviously, because it's my lived experience, I'm very aware of. And I bring up a lot of those issues when I'm teaching ESD, because that's something I'm familiar with. Like Nicole was talking about, like working with the LGBT community, I'm not part of the community. So I might have, blinders, or, not think about that. And when I'm teaching, not make it accessible to this community, because it's not something that I've had personal experience with. And I might say things or make assumptions of things, right, based on these identities that I don't hold, and sometimes that are not visible. And not only it's like the making assumptions because some identities are not visible, I think it's also the stereotypes, and it's being very aware that we all, because of how we were socialized, have biases. I can think specifically of a situation where I was co-facilitating a gender inclusive ESD workshop, and it was a pretty small group, and it was for like a gender issues class. So like people that I thought were like, okay, they're familiar with these things, right? Like I made this assumption that because they were in this class, that they knew, the ins and out of these issues. And we were doing the activity for boundaries with the hula hoop, where like, you have to protect your boundary. And so you have this hula hoop. And we had put what I perceive as a male identified individual, to defend his boundary, his hula hoop. And then we had 3 other students, and I believe 2 were like what I perceive as female identified, to be the aggressors. And then we had other groups, right? And some of them were, again, female identified inside. So I was focusing more on the ones where the female identified were trying to protect the boundaries, because of those biases, right? That I assume women are going to have a harder time setting those boundaries and might be activated more, at a higher rate, and completely dismiss this other individual, thinking he's male identified, I'm sure he got this. And, I quickly realized, and I'm really thankful for my co-facilitator, actually the person that was activated and having a really hard time was this, what I perceive a male identified individual, right? And he was really like, really anxious and was like having an emotional breakdown. And that was my own bias. right? The assumption that this man, or what I perceive as a man, would be able to, like, with no problem, set boundaries. So I think, again, when we're doing this, like, being aware of those biases, when we're creating prevention curriculum or models or presentations that we also bring to the table, not only for the identities that we don't perceive, but stereotypes of other identities that we might not be a part of. So I don't know. I guess it's like, what do we, when we're like people that have done this as prevention, when you're creating curriculum or when you're, presenting this, what are things that you make sure, like, if there's anyone out there that is interested in either themselves, doing this or bringing it to their campus or their organization as prevention, or specifically to provide it for survivors, what are things that you would recommend and say to these folks? Some tips.
What I do before I go to any presentation is I explain to them what I normally cover, and I ask, is there anything specific to your community that you'd like me to cover? Is there anything they need me to touch on, anything that you need me to change? I've worked with organizations that are like, no, everything you said is great. I've had some organizations like, yes, talk about this, but not this, or organizations that have told me they've had recent sexual assaults. And so they really wanted to, to hit on other aspects. I've worked with corporations that had, where I talked with legal departments for weeks to make sure that what I covered was matching up with company policy and wording. And I think it's just important to have that conversation, be open and say, here's what I normally cover. I'd like to make it specific to your group. If that's what you'd like, I'd like to be able to customize to your needs, and let them kind of guide that part of the conversation.
I think some of it is just part of the conversation that we have, the collaboration that you mentioned earlier, and inviting as many people to the table as possible, and then talk about the assumptions that we have about our bodies, about maybe even just the assumption that the attacker is always male identified. I mean, just have a brainstorming group to listen to all of those assumptions. I am a member of the LGBTQ community, and there's a certain amount of invisibility that goes along with that, and unless or until I announce that to some won't know that. So you may make assumptions, and if those go unchecked, then it doesn't get addressed. And so it's better if it's just out there. I mean, you've seen this, it's better if it's out there on the table and everybody is present and intentional about what they're doing. So those were my thoughts about it, as I'm hearing folks talk. And I think we're in agreement about that too.
Yeah, those are great tips. And, moving on to the healing component of ESD, Beth, I know you mentioned, I know everyone, I mean, all of us have worked with survivors, because we know that more than likely the individuals that are coming into our trainings have had, to some extent, some type of violence happen to them. But Beth, I know you specifically work with survivors, and I've worked with, like, directly one-on-one with survivors as well. And, when you're having this conversation with survivors about self-defense, right, as an empowerment, as a way of healing, not just to prevent, the violence, but as a way to heal and reconnect. Can you talk a little bit about your experience on that, and like how you present that to survivors? Because I know, like, myself, if that had been brought up to me when, what happened to me, I think I probably would have been like, no, right? Because again, I also saw violence as this negative thing, right? But I mean, violence can be used, like if you're using violence towards me, I'm able to also, like reframing that your body can also be used to defend yourself, especially after a violation like sexual violence or intimate partner violence. So I don't know, like I would love to hear from you in regards to like how you have those conversations and how you build that for people to feel comfortable to step into that as a healing modality.
A couple of different things come up. Sometimes I'm talking with folks who don't realize where their trauma lies on the spectrum, or on the continuum of violence. And so we have to have those conversations about someone making microaggressions and little comments and things like that, and where that lies on the continuum, and how that can often lead to even more dangerous situations. It just starts off real subtle, and and then I have some folks come to me, when they're, like I mentioned, in their late 70s, who say, I'm an intelligent woman. How is it that I missed this all this time? Well, then we walk through some of the themes that have come along, and just not realizing, oh my gosh, that's an abusive statement. That's infringing upon my rights. My right to exist, my right to have friends, my right to, see my family and that sort of thing. And I'm sure you've seen people in those situations as well. The other thing is the connection with the body, because so many of them are just disconnected altogether from their bodies. And so before we can even have the conversation about just setting some limits, and beginning to talk about asserting themselves, we have to get them grounded in their bodies, and talk about what they're feeling, what they're seeing, what they're hearing, smelling, and present, and how does that feel in here? So, there's work that has to be done with that. So we start small, and then we move, as a team through that. So I don't know if that helps or makes sense.
Yeah, it definitely
Maybe I'm
does.
using too much therapy language.
I mean, you're speaking my language, right?
Just let me know.
I think it's really important, right? Because we are a very diverse group of people. And I think that was what was very daunting for me, walking into a space of ESD when there was a martial artist, like arts background, right? That my language is very much, more about being trauma informed, right? And emotions and this holistic approach to it. And so I think it's important to mesh language is so important, right? When we're talking about these issues and then healing, meshing those two together. And I think what resonates from what you said, I know after I went to the train, because even going through the training, for me, it was a form of healing, even though I had done my work, right? Obviously, I was working as an advocate, so I've done my own personal work, which, I mean, healing, as much as they sell it to us as in this pretty package that's going to be beautiful and a walk to the park, we all know that that's, it's difficult. It's not as simple as that. So, and the healing's ongoing. But I had done a lot of my work, but what I realized is going through the training was healing for me. And I think the one thing that resonates, and that when I speak about like why it's important to teach this to survivors as well, is that as an advocate, my training and my background was to give people tools to be resilient. And usually resiliency comes with that emotional, like emotionally, I have the tools. Like I knew that if trauma occurred, happened to me again, that I had the tools to emotionally process it and deal with it, right? And I think that there's a huge focus in working with survivors about which obviously are very important. Mental health, mental well-being is really important. And having those tools and being resilient, emotionally resilient, spiritually resilient, is key in healing. But I know in my own healing and in my work as an advocate, I never thought about teaching people that, your body is also resilient and powerful. Like I always felt like I was emotionally very strong. I knew that, right? Like emotionally, I'm really strong. So if things happen to me, I have the emotional capacity to process. Um, but I was never really told that I could also be physically powerful to heal, right? And that I could use my body to defend myself, right? And to heal. And I think when I processed and I wrote something about my experience, that was the thing that really resonated with me, right? That I can be proud of being emotionally, strong, and that, but and my emotional strength can coexist with my physical strength, which I think a lot of times as survivors, we're not told that. We're told like you're really emotionally strong, right? Like you can do this. It's like you, and so I don't know. I don't know if that's something that in your work that's the conversation, right? Like we focus so much on all these other parts, but like the body, like your body's also strong, right? And your body can do amazing things.
Yeah, it takes them quite a while to get to that. And for me as a survivor, it was just the opposite. I had trained as a martial artist for 30 years, and I knew physically I could do things and I could fight back. But the emotional part, or the little subtle microaggressions, that was the tough part. So it was just the opposite. But yeah, it takes a while for some to integrate both.
Yeah, just listening to both of you. So it's sort of a merge between, because I originally was a psych major, but I also have a martial arts background, and did a lot of training at a dojo. I know that for ESD, it was extremely healing. Liz was there for it for some of my process. Yes, thank you so much. And it's interesting as a survivor because and a martial artist, because there's this thought that you have to be strong. You got to stick with it. You got to push through it. And I realized that I was coming from a very masculine form of strength and not willing to tap into this other form of strength, because if I did, then that would somehow show a weakness. So I remember my journey with ESD, because I've had a lot of different experiences in my life, and some of them actually happened at my martial arts school. And so I just remember Liz and Arlene Lemus, who were my facilitators for ESD, just being there at the moment when, for me, I just broke down. I was a hot mess, but it was this starting point, because I did not want to admit how very hurt I was because of the experiences that had happened. And I also really wanted to show that I was capable of being able to do this and to push through, and was capable of not only surviving but thriving. So like I've worked with all of these people, and part of me going to ESD training was, oh, I want to do this for them because like I need more training for them. But what I realized in that process was, okay, here are the floodgates. Let's open them. This is what's going on. Now let's start the real work with yourself. And I think that that's a huge lesson for a lot of instructors and practitioners as you are going through this process where you are learning to train, you're learning these different disciplines, which have been so helpful and useful in my life, to also recognize what pains have come up in your life and be open and willing to heal them, so that you can be a better person, not only for your students, but for yourself. So that was just kind of an interesting aha for me in the process of learning ESD, and how it is very, very effective for people who have previously experienced trauma.
Yeah. And, Rika, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I love all of the thoughts we heard today, and just my summary of the whole thing is that empowerment self-defense empowers you in your physical, verbal, emotional, and mental capabilities, and I think that's why it's such a powerful and effective way of violence prevention. So that's why I think it's a really really good way to learn it.
Yeah, I definitely think that again, bringing all these different experts, right? I think that's the value of like having a background in therapy, having a background in advocacy, having a background in martial arts, and really incorporating all this language and this knowledge to be holistic when we're addressing these issues from a preventative lens, but also from like a healing. And the reality that survivors experience multiple traumas, right? So it's being preventative, even when you're working with survivors, right? Because I know in my work, a lot of them came in with complex trauma. And the unfortunate reality as well that a lot of them might experience trauma again or be re-traumatized, right? So having these tools to continue moving forward and like Tasha said, thrive. I am really appreciative of everyone's time and I want to be mindful of that. I think this is a great conversation. And I mean, gender-based violence, prevention, ESD are topics that I can talk on like forever about. And I feel like we could probably all of us sit here and talk forever. But just to kind of recap, if there's anything else that, you feel like is really important that you would want the audience to like know or take away from this segment in regards to like your work and how, those intersect with violence prevention and, working with survivors of interpersonal violence. We'll go with Nicole and then Liz.
I just wanted to say that I think it's really important for survivors to understand that when they take an empowerment self-defense class, it can be so healing, but they have to be ready for it. As many of you have expressed when you've taken the class, like it brings up a lot of emotions. It brings up flashbacks. I've had students in classes that have, had moments where things just came back, and to be able to help them through that is why I do this work, to be able to see them through to the other side and then have them come out on the other side of that and feel like they're stronger than they were before and that they feel like they've reclaimed their power is just so rewarding. But you have to be ready for it. Like it's there for you, but it's important to know that there's a lot that's going to come up from it. So you might want to speak with your therapist or a counselor, someone while you're going through a empowerment self-defense class or before. A lot of counselors or therapists will recommend self-defense classes for that reason, to help survivors through it. But it's just important to know, like, you got to be ready, because it's there. It can help you, but you got to be ready.
I just wanted to add, again, kind of what I said at the very beginning, which is that empowerment self-defense is a fantastic tool for the everyday and for that moment of everything has gone wrong. It's important that we emphasize to organizations that still view empowerment self-defense as this sort of victim blaming technique or whatever, that it isn't, that it is a very important aspect of an overall plan if we're really, really going to make a dent in any sort of not just gender-based violence, but violence in general. We can't just address the long term, and we can't just address the immediate. We have to address the whole package if we're going to make a change over one generation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an advocate of this being a tool for survivors and prevention. But to me also, I think it's so healing for facilitators, healers, therapists to also, participate in empowerment self-defense, right? I know myself as a facilitator and as someone that I work hand in hand with survivors in their healing. Some of the things that also came up was, some of the experiences that I didn't have, right? But I knew, and I mean, we know that vicarious trauma is real. And this is, to me, was also another way of releasing that. And when I was put in situations that maybe I didn't experience, but I knew some of the people I work with experienced, it also, I think that was very also something that I never knew that it was something that I needed to unpack and work through, to be a better advocate. So I also, I really appreciated that. And it really helped me in my work, not just myself as an individual, but in the work that I was doing.
And I would just like to say, you know, everything that everyone's said today, it's always just wonderful to have groups of women who are from all different backgrounds and all different walks of life too. And we have an intergenerational group here. And so I really appreciate all of you because you all have such great knowledge in all of these different areas, and I just feel so honored to have all of you here. It really means a lot, and it's exciting to see another human outside of my job. So I really appreciate all of you for that. But thank you so much for each of you coming on. It means the world to us, and I'm excited to see what continues to come and grow out of this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Again. Thank you.
It's
and we
great
will
to meet you and to see you.
Same. And for the audience, we will be including everyone's information. If you are interested in taking different, I know some of us have moved to virtual ESD, we'll be including that information. That way, if you are interested in taking a class or just, connecting with all our, guests here, you'll have that information. We'll link that for y'all. Again, thank you. Have a great night. It was really nice to connect with everyone.